The Vietnam War ended with the United States withdrawing its forces after winning the vast majority of its major battles. From Ia Drang to Hue, from search and destroy operations to large-scale air campaigns, American firepower consistently overwhelmed opposing units on the battlefield. By conventional military logic, this should have produced victory. It did not. How does a superpower that rarely loses tactically fail to achieve its strategic objective? Why did overwhelming superiority in technology, logistics, and battlefield performance translate into political exhaustion instead of decisive control? And more unsettling still, what if the war was never designed to be won in the way the United States was trying to win it? Because Vietnam was not a contest over territory alone. It was a confrontation between two incompatible definitions of victory, one measurable, one political, and only one of them could survive a long war. This episode dissects how a war can be won repeatedly and still be lost. The strategic problem of the Vietnam War was never the absence of military capability. It was the absence of a coherent definition of victory that could survive political reality. The United States entered the conflict with a set of implicit assumptions inherited from industrial-era warfare. If enemy forces are destroyed faster than they can be replaced, resistance collapses. If territory is cleared repeatedly, control eventually stabilizes. If military pressure is sustained, political outcomes will follow. Vietnam violated every one of these assumptions. American commanders were tasked with achieving a political outcome, preserving a viable South Vietnamese state, using instruments optimized for battlefield dominance, not political endurance. Every tactical success increased commitment without clarifying an endpoint. Every escalation raised costs without eliminating the adversary's ability to continue. The war thus became structurally paradoxical. The United States could not disengage without appearing to lose. But it could not escalate to decisive victory without triggering unacceptable political and moral consequences, domestically and internationally. This is why Vietnam represents a genuinely unorthodox strategic failure. Not because American forces performed poorly, but because the war was fought inside a strategic framework that could not convert military success into political resolution. The central question, then, is not why the United States lost battles. It is why winning battles was never sufficient, and may have been strategically irrelevant from the beginning. To understand that contradiction, we must first map the battlefield that actually mattered. To understand why the Vietnam War evolved the way it did, we need to redraw the map. Not the geographic map of jungles, rivers, and borders, but the strategic map that defined what each side was actually fighting for. On one side stood the United States, operating within a Cold War framework shaped by deterrence theory, alliance credibility, and containment. The war in Vietnam was never isolated. It was embedded in a global signaling system. Every decision in Southeast Asia echoed in Europe, East Asia, and Washington's domestic political arena. On the other side stood an adversary whose objectives were narrower, harsher, and structurally different. They were not attempting to defeat the United States militarily in a conventional sense. They were attempting to make continued American involvement politically unsustainable. This asymmetry of objectives is the first fault line. For the United States, the war had to satisfy multiple, often conflicting constraints simultaneously. It had to deter rivals without provoking direct superpower confrontation. It had to support an allied government without appearing colonial. It had to apply overwhelming force without crossing moral thresholds unacceptable to a democratic society. And it had to demonstrate progress fast enough to survive electoral cycles. These constraints shaped everything, from rules of engagement to escalation pacing. They also created a strategic environment where how the war was fought mattered as much as whether it was fought. The opposing side operated under a different logic. Time was not a liability, it was leverage. Territory was not a permanent asset, it was a temporary condition. Losses were tragic, but not disqualifying, so long as organizational continuity survived. This difference produced a battlefield where the visible fight and the decisive struggle diverged. On the surface, the battlefield favored the United States. Superior mobility. Superior firepower. Superior logistics. American forces could concentrate force at will, disengage when necessary, and replace losses rapidly. In most direct engagements, this translated into tactical dominance. But beneath that surface lay a second battlefield, one defined by political legitimacy, narrative control, and endurance. Here, the United States was constrained by its own system. Every deployment required public justification. Every escalation required political consensus. Every casualty accumulated not only as a military statistic, but as a domestic political cost. The war therefore unfolded under a constant clock, not a military one, but a political one. This clock did not tick in Hanoi. It ticked in Washington. That distinction mattered. Because the adversary did not need to win quickly. They needed only to avoid losing in a way that forced political collapse on their side. Their strategy did not require battlefield dominance. It required persistence, adaptability, and the ability to impose uncertainty. The strategic terrain amplified this logic. Vietnam's geography favored dispersion over concentration. Dense vegetation, fragmented settlements, porous borders, and extended rural networks made permanent control extraordinarily costly. Clearing an area did not guarantee holding it. Holding it did not guarantee legitimacy. And legitimacy could not be imposed by firepower alone. For the United States, this created a recurring dilemma. If forces focused on large unit engagements, they could inflict heavy losses, but leave political influence untouched. If they focused on population control, they risked entanglement in local grievances, governance failures, and legitimacy deficits they did not control. Either choice carried costs. Neither offered closure. Time intensified the problem. The longer the war continued, the more resources were committed, not just materially, but reputationally. Withdrawal increasingly implied failure. Continuation increasingly demanded justification. This is where the strategic environment became self-reinforcing. Success on the battlefield created expectations of progress. When progress failed to materialize politically, pressure mounted for escalation. Escalation raised costs and visibility, tightening the political clock further. Meanwhile, the opposing side adapted. They learned when to fight and when to disappear. They learned how to absorb losses without strategic collapse. They learned how to synchronize military action with political messaging. Crucially, they learned that American strength could be turned into a constraint. Large formations required logistics. Logistics required visibility. Visibility created predictability. Predictability allowed avoidance. This did not mean the United States lacked options. It meant that every option existed inside a narrowing corridor of political tolerance. The strategic landscape of Vietnam was therefore not static. It was elastic, but asymmetrically so. The United States faced a shrinking margin for error. The opposing side faced a shrinking population, but a widening political opportunity. That imbalance defined the war. Not because one side was smarter in every engagement, but because one side aligned its strategy with the true center of gravity of the conflict, and the other did not. And it is here, within this constrained strategic environment, that the conventional playbook begins to fail. Because when the battlefield is no longer the decisive arena, when time favors the weaker side, and when political cost outweighs tactical success, the correct military response becomes the wrong strategic move. And that realization forces a confrontation with doctrine itself. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It codifies lessons from past wars into principles that can be taught, replicated, and trusted under pressure. In Vietnam, that doctrine was clear, and deeply mismatched with the war it was applied to. At the core of American military thinking in the mid-20th century lay a set of assumptions shaped by World War II and Korea. Wars were expected to culminate in decisive engagements. Enemy forces were expected to mass, defend key terrain, and suffer collapse once losses exceeded replacement capacity. Victory, therefore, was achieved through destruction of formations, infrastructure, and command capability. From this perspective, the correct response in Vietnam appeared obvious. Find the enemy. Fix them in place. Apply overwhelming firepower. Repeat until resistance breaks. This logic was not reckless. It had worked before. It was supported by industrial capacity, technological superiority, and a professional officer corps trained to execute it with precision. But Vietnam was not a war that rewarded correctness. The problem was not that doctrine was poorly executed. The problem was that doctrine targeted the wrong variables. American strategy treated enemy forces as the primary center of gravity. But the adversary did not organize itself around decisive battles. It organized around survival, regeneration, and political effect. Doctrine assumed that attrition would force strategic decision. In Vietnam, attrition was absorbed, redistributed, and reframed. This created a fatal disconnect. From the American perspective, destroying enemy units was progress. From the adversary's perspective, losing units was acceptable so long as organizational continuity remained intact and political pressure on the United States increased. Doctrine had no answer for this asymmetry. Because doctrine does not teach how to fight an enemy who does not need to win. Search and destroy operations illustrate the contradiction. In doctrinal terms, they were logical. They sought to bring enemy forces into contact, leverage superior mobility, and impose disproportionate losses. Tactically, they often succeeded. Strategically, they solved nothing. Enemy units could disengage at will. Areas cleared could not be permanently held without political infrastructure. Civilian disruption created grievances that fed recruitment and undermined legitimacy. Doctrine measured success in engagements. The war demanded success in outcomes that doctrine did not know how to measure. This is where the system began to break down. Commanders were evaluated on metrics aligned with doctrine: engagements won, casualties inflicted, operations conducted. Political leadership demanded visible evidence of progress. Doctrine provided numbers. Those numbers became substitutes for strategy. Body counts, sortie totals, and cleared zones offered the appearance of momentum. But they did not reduce the adversary's capacity to continue the war on their own terms. In effect, doctrine incentivized behavior that stabilized the conflict rather than resolved it. The deeper problem lay in escalation logic. Doctrine taught that if initial pressure fails, increased pressure should follow. More forces. More firepower. Expanded operational scope. In Vietnam, escalation carried political consequences that doctrine treated as externalities. Each escalation raised domestic scrutiny. Each increase in force commitment narrowed political flexibility. Each additional loss amplified dissent. Doctrine assumed that escalation would compress the enemy's options. Instead, it compressed America's. This created a strategic trap. If the United States reduced pressure, it risked signaling weakness. If it increased pressure, it deepened political vulnerability without guaranteeing resolution. Doctrine offered no off-ramp, only repetition. Even attempts to adapt remained constrained by doctrinal gravity. Counterinsurgency concepts existed, but they conflicted with the scale and tempo of American operations. Population security required patience, restraint, and political integration. Large-scale military action required speed, visibility, and decisive force. The two logics collided. Doctrine favored clarity. Vietnam demanded ambiguity. Doctrine favored decisive action. Vietnam rewarded restraint and endurance. Doctrine prepared commanders to win battles. Vietnam required them to manage a system, political, social, and informational, that extended far beyond the battlefield. Most critically, doctrine assumed that the enemy sought to avoid losses. In Vietnam, losses were often the price paid to impose strategic costs elsewhere. This inversion is what made the war so resistant to conventional solutions. From a doctrinal viewpoint, refusing to concentrate forces looked like weakness. From a strategic viewpoint, it denied the United States a target it could decisively destroy. From a doctrinal viewpoint, abandoning territory looked like defeat. From a strategic viewpoint, it preserved flexibility and reduced exposure. From a doctrinal viewpoint, prolonged war was failure. From a strategic viewpoint, prolonged war was leverage. This is why Vietnam forced an uncomfortable realization. If the United States followed its own playbook, it could not end the war on acceptable terms. If it abandoned that playbook, it risked losing coherence, credibility, and internal consensus. There was no clean solution, only trade-offs that doctrine was never designed to evaluate. And that is the critical insight. Vietnam was not a case of bad execution of good doctrine. It was a case where doctrine itself became a liability. Because doctrine answers the question, how do we fight? Vietnam demanded an answer to a different question, why does fighting this way not produce victory? That question would fracture assumptions inside command structures, create internal resistance to adaptation, and delay recognition of the war's true center of gravity. And within that doctrinal rigidity, a different kind of decision began to take shape, one that did not seek decisive battle, but decisive pressure. A strategy built not on destroying the enemy faster, but on surviving the war longer. That decision did not emerge cleanly. It emerged through friction, doubt, and internal conflict. And that is where the real break with convention begins. Unorthodox strategies rarely announce themselves as such. They emerge quietly, often in fragments, inside systems that are not designed to accept them. In Vietnam, there was no single moment where one side formally declared a rejection of conventional victory. There was no clean doctrinal pivot, no unified manifesto. Instead, the strategy that would eventually exhaust American power formed under pressure, through trial, error, and internal contradiction. The first fractures appeared in how the war was experienced rather than how it was planned. Repeated engagements demonstrated a pattern that doctrine struggled to explain. Enemy units accepted losses that should have been operationally crippling, yet reappeared weeks or months later. Territory was cleared repeatedly, yet political control remained unstable. Escalation produced visibility, not closure. These outcomes forced an uncomfortable reassessment. Not everyone agreed on what they meant. Within American command structures, disagreement emerged over interpretation. Some believed the solution lay in greater intensity, more forces, broader authority, fewer constraints. Others suspected that the war's structure itself was misaligned with available tools. But on the opposing side, the interpretation was far more consistent. They were observing not American strength, but American limits. They saw a military that could deploy power almost without restraint, but only for as long as its political system allowed. They saw commanders under pressure to demonstrate progress quickly. They saw a society where time, not territory, was the decisive variable. From that observation, a set of strategic assumptions began to solidify. The first assumption was brutally simple. The United States could not remain indefinitely at the level of commitment required to impose decisive control. This was not a moral judgment. It was a structural one. A democratic system at war abroad must continuously justify cost. Casualties, expenditures, and ambiguity all accumulate political friction. That friction does not need to produce immediate collapse. It only needs to raise the threshold for continuation year after year. The second assumption followed naturally. Victory did not require battlefield dominance. It required denial of strategic closure. As long as the war could not be resolved on terms acceptable to Washington, pressure would grow internally to alter course. Every year without resolution would compound political cost, regardless of tactical outcomes. This reframed loss itself. Losses were no longer merely endured, they were contextualized. If a loss contributed to prolonging the war while preserving organizational continuity, it served a strategic function. The metric was not kill ratios or territory held. It was whether the war remained open-ended. The third assumption was the most dangerous. Escalation by the United States would accelerate, not resolve, the contradiction. This ran directly against conventional logic. Escalation was expected to impose clarity. But clarity required an endpoint, and Vietnam offered none that aligned with American political constraints. Every escalation increased exposure. Every increase in exposure raised expectations of success. Every failure to meet those expectations intensified domestic pressure. This was the pressure spiral. The opposing strategy did not seek to prevent escalation. It sought to shape it. By calibrating engagement, fighting when advantageous, withdrawing when pressure peaked, the war could be kept below the threshold of decisive confrontation while remaining costly enough to sustain political strain. This was not improvisation. It was systemic adaptation. Internally, this approach demanded extraordinary discipline. Avoiding decisive battle required restraint even under provocation. Preserving forces required accepting the appearance of weakness. Prolonging war required confidence that time would continue to work in their favor. None of these choices were intuitive. They violated deeply ingrained military instincts, especially the desire to stand and fight. They also carried existential risk. If American political tolerance proved higher than expected, prolonged war could become unsustainable for the weaker side first. If internal cohesion fractured, endurance would collapse into attrition. This is why the strategy was not universally accepted even within its own ranks. There were debates, often unrecorded, over pace, exposure, and acceptable loss. There were tensions between local imperatives and strategic patience. There were moments when pressure to escalate on their side threatened to undermine long-term objectives. But what ultimately stabilized the approach was consistency of outcome. Despite heavy losses, the organizational structure remained intact. Despite territorial reversals, the war did not end. Despite tactical defeats, political pressure inside the United States intensified. Each cycle reinforced the underlying assumptions. Meanwhile, American decision-makers faced a different dynamic. They were not choosing between victory and defeat. They were choosing between types of failure. Reducing commitment risked reputational damage. Increasing commitment risked domestic fracture. Maintaining the status quo risked endless cost without resolution. In this environment, decision-making became reactive. Short-term objectives replaced long-term coherence. Demonstrations of resolve substituted for strategic clarity. Doctrine continued to provide familiar answers, even as evidence mounted that those answers no longer aligned with reality. This asymmetry in adaptation was decisive. One side was optimizing for endurance under pressure. The other was optimizing for performance under scrutiny. And that difference shaped how the war was actually fought. The unorthodox decision, then, was not a single choice. It was a commitment to a framework that treated the war as a test of systems rather than forces. A test of which political structure could absorb ambiguity longer. A test of which society could tolerate unresolved violence without internal collapse. A test of whether power could be neutralized by patience. But assumptions are fragile. They hold only as long as conditions remain within expected bounds. They collapse when stress exceeds tolerance. Which is why the most dangerous phase of this strategy was not its conception, but its execution. Because once translated from theory into action, every weakness became visible. Every delay carried risk. And every miscalculation threatened to unravel the entire structure. The strategy could survive losses. It could survive setbacks. But it could not survive exposure. And that meant execution would be a constant exercise in risk management, under fire. Execution is where unorthodox strategy is most likely to fail. On paper, endurance sounds abstract. In practice, it demands constant coordination, discipline, and risk tolerance under conditions of sustained pressure. The central challenge was translation. How do you convert a strategic idea, survive longer than the opponent's political will, into daily operational behavior without losing control of the system? The answer was not elegance. It was friction management. Execution relied on three interlocking mechanisms: dispersion, regeneration, and denial. Dispersion came first. Large formations were liabilities. They invited detection, fixation, and destruction. So forces were broken down into smaller, flexible units capable of operating independently while remaining connected through organizational networks. This was not improvisation. It was structural. Dispersion reduced losses per engagement. It increased ambiguity for the opponent. It allowed disengagement without collapse. But dispersion carried its own risks. Small units are harder to coordinate. They strain command and control. They require trust in local decision-making, and trust is fragile under pressure. To compensate, execution depended on regeneration. Losses were expected. Units would be degraded. The critical question was not how to avoid loss, but how quickly lost capability could be replaced. Regeneration relied on depth, organizational, logistical, and social. Training pipelines were simplified. Replacement did not require mastery of complex systems. The emphasis was on function, not perfection. This allowed the system to absorb shocks. Where a conventional force might lose irreplaceable assets, specialists, equipment, cohesion, this system traded efficiency for resilience. But regeneration was not free. It imposed a continuous burden on human networks. It relied on sustained recruitment, discipline, and ideological cohesion. Any disruption in these inputs threatened long-term viability. Which is why denial became the third pillar. Denial was not about defeating American forces directly. It was about denying them the conditions required for decisive victory. Denying targets. Denying permanence. Denying closure. When pressure increased, units withdrew. When visibility rose, activity declined. When engagement favored the opponent, the system went quiet. This frustrated conventional planning. Operations designed to culminate in decisive engagements instead encountered absence. Firepower found no fixed center. Success could not be consolidated. But denial was a delicate balance. Too much withdrawal risked loss of relevance. Too much engagement risked exposure. Execution required constant calibration. And this is where risk concentrated. Because execution did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred under relentless surveillance, pressure, and adaptation by a vastly superior military. American forces learned quickly. They improved detection. They refined mobility. They increased operational tempo. Each improvement narrowed the margin for error. The unorthodox strategy depended on maintaining that margin. Logistics became the pressure point. A dispersed force still requires supply. Food, weapons, medical support, communication, these cannot be improvised indefinitely. The logistical system therefore mirrored the operational one. Distributed. Redundant. Low signature. Supply routes avoided predictability. Storage was decentralized. Losses were anticipated. This made the system harder to destroy, but also harder to protect. Every logistical node was vulnerable. Every movement carried risk. Every failure propagated stress through the network. The cost was constant. Not in dramatic collapses, but in attrition of capacity, morale, and human endurance. This is the side of execution rarely discussed. Endurance strategies do not reduce suffering. They redistribute it. Instead of concentrated destruction, they produce prolonged strain. Instead of decisive battles, they produce endless pressure. Psychologically, this is corrosive. Fighters operate without the expectation of resolution. Losses are absorbed without closure. Victory is defined negatively, as the absence of defeat. Maintaining cohesion under these conditions requires extraordinary control. Which brings us to the internal risks. Execution demanded discipline not to overreach. Local commanders had to resist the temptation to exploit tactical opportunities that could trigger disproportionate retaliation. This restraint was counterintuitive. Military training emphasizes seizing advantage. Here, advantage was often declined. That created tension. Local success could endanger strategic survival. Local caution could appear as weakness. Managing this tension required constant reinforcement of strategic priorities, often at the expense of individual initiative. That carries its own dangers. Too much centralization stifles adaptation. Too little invites fragmentation. The margin was thin. And then there were the moments when the system nearly failed. Periods of intensified American pressure strained logistics to breaking points. Sustained campaigns threatened to expose networks faster than they could regenerate. At several junctures, the assumption that time favored endurance was tested. If American political tolerance had held slightly longer. If escalation had remained just below domestic rupture. If external conditions had shifted even marginally. The entire strategy could have collapsed under accumulated strain. This is the most important point. Unorthodox strategies are not clever shortcuts. They are high-risk commitments. They depend on the opponent behaving predictably. They depend on internal cohesion holding under extreme stress. They depend on external variables aligning within narrow bounds. Execution magnifies every assumption. A misjudgment in political timing. A failure in logistics. A loss of narrative control. Any of these could have reversed the strategic equation. Which is why success was never guaranteed. The system survived not because it was invulnerable, but because it remained just resilient enough, just adaptive enough, and just opaque enough to avoid decisive collapse. Meanwhile, the opposing system faced a different problem. Execution on the American side was efficient, but brittle. High performance depended on constant justification. Operational success demanded visibility. Visibility fed political scrutiny. Every success raised expectations. Every unmet expectation intensified pressure. This created a divergence. One side optimized for surviving stress. The other optimized for demonstrating progress. Execution exposed that difference relentlessly. And as the war continued, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Because execution does not end with one side acting. It ends with the other side reacting. And in Vietnam, those reactions would prove strategically decisive, not because they were irrational, but because they followed a logic that no longer matched the war being fought. The moment of failure did not come from collapse on the battlefield. It came from misinterpretation. From reacting correctly to the wrong signals. And that is where the balance finally tipped. The failure of the United States in Vietnam did not come from ignorance. It came from misinterpretation. American commanders and policymakers were not blind to what was happening. They saw the pattern: engagements without resolution, territory without control, attrition without collapse. What they misunderstood was what those signals meant. From the American perspective, the war appeared to be one of insufficient pressure. If the enemy continued to fight, it meant pressure had not reached the breaking point. If territory reverted after clearance, it meant operations had not been sustained long enough. If political stability failed to follow military success, it meant commitment was incomplete. These conclusions were logical, inside the wrong framework. The United States interpreted persistence as resistance. In reality, persistence was the strategy. This distinction is critical. American intelligence and command structures read enemy behavior through doctrinal filters. Avoidance of decisive battle was interpreted as weakness. Withdrawal was interpreted as degradation. Losses were interpreted as cumulative damage. Each interpretation reinforced the belief that the war was being won, slowly, expensively, but inevitably. This belief shaped reaction. Escalation followed. More troops were deployed. More sorties were flown. More resources were committed. Each escalation was intended to force clarity. Instead, it produced ambiguity. Because escalation strengthened the adversary's central assumption: that the United States would continue to respond predictably to pressure. This is where structural bias took hold. American decision-making was constrained by visibility. Actions had to be explainable, to Congress, to allies, to the public. Visible force was legible force. Subtle adaptation was politically risky. Restraint was difficult to defend. Ambiguity looked like indecision. So responses gravitated toward what could be demonstrated. Troop numbers. Bomb tonnage. Operational tempo. These signals reassured domestic audiences in the short term. They also reassured the adversary that the war was unfolding along expected lines. This feedback loop was devastating. Every escalation increased cost without changing the structure of the conflict. Every visible success deepened political investment. Every deepened investment narrowed exit options. The adversary did not need to manipulate this loop directly. They only needed to survive it. Reaction was also shaped by institutional inertia. Large organizations adapt slowly. They rely on established processes. They resist shifts that threaten coherence. Within American command structures, adaptation occurred, but within boundaries. Tactical innovation was encouraged. Operational refinement was rewarded. Strategic reframing was resisted. Why? Because reframing implied that prior effort had been misdirected. It implied sunk costs. It implied accountability. It is easier to argue that more effort is required than to argue that effort itself is misaligned. This is not unique to Vietnam. It is a feature of large systems under pressure. The result was strategic lock-in. Once the United States committed to a particular theory of victory, attrition leading to political collapse, it became increasingly difficult to abandon it without institutional rupture. Signals that contradicted the theory were explained away. Signals that supported it were amplified. This cognitive filtering shaped reaction at every level. Even when dissent emerged, it struggled to translate into action. Alternative approaches, political integration, reduced visibility, negotiated de-escalation, carried their own risks. They offered no immediate metrics of success. They could not guarantee credibility. In contrast, escalation promised control, even if that promise proved hollow. The adversary understood this. They did not need to outthink American commanders tactically. They needed to let American institutions behave as designed. Every time the United States reacted to persistence with escalation, it confirmed the adversary's strategic diagnosis. The war was not drifting. It was converging. converging toward a point where continuation would no longer be politically tenable, regardless of battlefield outcomes. This is why reaction mattered more than action. The adversary could absorb losses. They could replace units. They could adapt tactically. What they could not control was American political tolerance. But they did not need to. They only needed to ensure that American reactions kept raising the cost of staying without providing a credible path to victory. And that is exactly what happened. Each major response was rational. Each escalation was defensible. Each decision followed from the information available at the time. Collectively, they formed a pattern that the war's structure punished. This is the cruel logic of unorthodox warfare. You do not defeat your opponent by forcing mistakes. You defeat them by encouraging correct decisions inside a flawed frame. The United States did not react irrationally. It reacted consistently. And consistency, in this war, was the vulnerability. By the time the contradiction became undeniable, that tactical success was not accumulating into strategic resolution, the political cost of changing course had become prohibitive. The window for reframing had closed. From that point on, the war could only end one way. Not with collapse on the battlefield. Not with decisive defeat. But with a recognition that the cost of continuation exceeded the value of the objective. That recognition would come slowly. Painfully. And at a price that extended far beyond Vietnam itself. Because unorthodox strategies do not end when the fighting stops. They end when the system that sustains the war can no longer justify itself. And that moment brings us to the final reckoning. The outcome, and the cost, of a strategy that was never meant to win battles. The Vietnam War did not end with a decisive military defeat. It ended with a strategic acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that continued effort would not produce a political outcome proportional to its cost. This distinction matters. Because wars that end in defeat tend to produce clarity. Wars that end in exhaustion produce reckoning. The immediate outcome was visible. American forces withdrew. Commitments were reduced, then terminated. What had once been framed as essential to global credibility was reclassified as unsustainable. But the deeper outcome lay beneath the surface. The war exposed a structural vulnerability in how power was exercised. The United States had demonstrated that it could dominate battlefields indefinitely. What it could not demonstrate was how to translate that dominance into political resolution when the adversary refused to fight on those terms. This was not failure by incompetence. It was failure by mismatch. The strategy that ultimately prevailed was not one of battlefield superiority, but of cost manipulation. It forced a stronger opponent to confront limits that were political rather than military. That victory, however, came at a price, on all sides. The human cost was immediate and irreducible. Lives lost did not accumulate into closure. They accumulated into strain. For American society, casualties became symbols of ambiguity rather than sacrifice toward a clear end. For those fighting on the ground, the absence of a definable victory condition intensified psychological burden. War without a horizon corrodes morale differently than war with a clear objective. On the other side, endurance demanded staggering sacrifice. Losses were absorbed not because they were insignificant, but because strategic logic required it. Entire communities carried the weight of prolonged conflict. The strategy asked not for brilliance, but for tolerance of suffering over time. This is the reality often obscured by abstract discussion of patience and endurance. Endurance is not passive. It is paid for daily. The logistical cost was equally profound. For the United States, the war consumed resources without yielding decisive strategic dividends. The scale of investment created pressure to justify continuation even as returns diminished. For the opposing side, sustaining dispersed logistics under constant attack required extraordinary redundancy. Every supply line was fragile. Every disruption compounded risk. Neither side escaped depletion. But it was the political cost that proved decisive. In the United States, Vietnam fractured consensus. Trust in institutions eroded. Civil-military relations strained. Public confidence in strategic judgment weakened. The war did not simply end a policy. It reshaped how American society perceived the use of force. Future interventions would be judged through the lens of Vietnam, not because Vietnam was unique, but because it revealed a category of conflict where superiority did not guarantee control. This legacy extended into doctrine, politics, and culture. Strategic caution increased. Aversion to prolonged ground engagement hardened. The demand for clear objectives intensified. These were not overreactions. They were adaptations to a lesson learned at high cost. For the side that pursued endurance, the price was different, but no less severe. Victory validated the strategy, but also entrenched a model that normalized prolonged sacrifice as acceptable. The success of endurance can obscure its fragility. It works only under specific conditions. It demands extraordinary cohesion. It tolerates levels of loss that may not be repeatable. Had any assumption failed, had American political tolerance held longer, had internal cohesion fractured earlier, the strategy could have collapsed catastrophically. This is the uncomfortable truth. The strategy that prevailed was not inherently superior. It was contextually aligned. It fit the opponent's political structure better than the opponent's strategy fit its own. That is why Vietnam remains so unsettling. It resists moral simplification. It resists tidy lessons. It forces acknowledgement that power, when misapplied, can accelerate its own limits. The war did not prove that military force is irrelevant. It proved that force without strategic congruence becomes self-defeating. And perhaps the most enduring cost was conceptual. Vietnam destabilized the assumption that wars are won by accumulating advantage. It introduced the possibility that advantage, if mismatched, can prolong conflict rather than resolve it. That realization continues to shape strategic thinking today. Because Vietnam was not a historical anomaly. It was an early demonstration of a pattern that would reappear whenever a strong actor confronts an adversary willing to trade loss for time and clarity for endurance. Which brings us to the final question. What, exactly, did this war reveal about strategy itself? Not tactics. Not technology. But the underlying logic of power in conflicts where victory is defined differently by each side. To answer that, we must strip the war of its details and look at its structure. Only then does the true lesson come into focus. Vietnam does not teach a lesson about tactics. It does not teach a lesson about technology. And it does not teach a lesson about courage or competence. It teaches a lesson about alignment. Specifically, alignment between how a war is fought and how a war can politically end. Strip Vietnam of its geography, ideology, and historical detail, and a stark structure remains. One side fought to impose outcomes. The other fought to prevent outcomes from ever stabilizing. One side measured success through accumulation, more control, more pressure, more effort. The other measured success through delay, more time, more ambiguity, more cost. Neither approach was irrational. But only one was structurally compatible with the political systems involved. This is the first principle Vietnam exposes. Power is not absolute. It is conditional on the system that must sustain it. The United States possessed overwhelming material power. But that power had to pass through layers of political legitimacy, public consent, alliance management, and moral justification. Each layer filtered what was possible. Escalation was not a pure military decision. It was a political transaction with diminishing returns. The opposing strategy did not need to negate American power. It needed to force that power to operate at maximum cost and minimum clarity. Which leads to the second principle. In asymmetric conflicts, the decisive variable is often not strength, but tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for loss. Tolerance for time without resolution. Vietnam revealed that tolerance is not evenly distributed across political systems. A system that demands justification will eventually require results that are visible, decisive, and narratively coherent. A system that prioritizes survival over justification can accept outcomes that appear stagnant or costly in the short term. This asymmetry cannot be corrected by force alone. The third principle follows directly. When victory cannot be clearly defined, escalation becomes self-defeating. Escalation assumes a horizon. It assumes that increased effort compresses time toward resolution. Vietnam inverted that assumption. Every escalation raised expectations that could not be met. Every unmet expectation increased political strain. Every increase in strain narrowed future options. Escalation did not accelerate victory. It accelerated exhaustion. This does not mean restraint would have guaranteed success. It means that escalation, within this structure, guaranteed failure. The fourth principle is more unsettling. Correct decisions inside a flawed strategic frame will compound failure. The United States did not lose Vietnam by making irrational choices. It lost by making rational choices repeatedly, based on assumptions that no longer held. Deploying more forces made sense. Applying more pressure made sense. Demonstrating resolve made sense. Each decision followed logically from the last. What did not make sense was the framework that defined what those decisions were supposed to achieve. This is why Vietnam is so difficult to fix in hindsight. There is no single mistake to correct. There is no moment where one decision clearly doomed the effort. Failure emerged from coherence, from consistency, from alignment between doctrine, institutions, and political incentives, none of which matched the war's actual center of gravity. The final principle is the most important. Strategy is not about winning fights. It is about choosing the kind of failure you are willing to risk. In Vietnam, the United States faced three options: withdraw early and accept reputational damage, escalate indefinitely and risk internal fracture, continue at scale and absorb mounting costs without resolution. None were good. But strategy demanded choosing one consciously. Instead, the war drifted. Drift is the enemy of strategy. Drift allows costs to accumulate without commitment to consequence. It postpones reckoning while deepening exposure. It converts temporary engagement into structural entrapment. The opposing strategy exploited drift perfectly. It did not force catastrophic defeat. It removed all acceptable paths to victory. And when no acceptable path remains, even the strongest actor must eventually disengage. This is the enduring danger of unorthodox warfare. Not that it defeats power outright, but that it reframes the cost-benefit equation until power defeats itself. Vietnam was not an exception. It was a warning. A warning that dominance in capability does not guarantee dominance in outcome. A warning that wars are systems, not events. A warning that strategy must begin with political reality, not end with it. And perhaps most importantly, Vietnam teaches this. If you cannot clearly articulate what winning looks like, and how it ends, you are not fighting a war. You are managing decline under pressure. That is not a moral judgment. It is a structural one. And it is why Vietnam remains one of the most important case studies in modern strategy, not because of how it was fought, but because of how it could not be finished. The Vietnam War did not expose a lack of American power. It exposed the limits of power applied without strategic congruence. It showed that wars are not decided solely by who can destroy more, move faster, or deploy further. They are decided by whose definition of victory survives contact with political reality. In Vietnam, the battlefield favored one side. The structure of the war favored the other. That mismatch was never fully resolved. So the war ended not with surrender or collapse, but with withdrawal. Not because the United States was defeated militarily, but because continuation no longer made strategic sense. This is why Vietnam still matters. Because the conditions that shaped it have not disappeared. Power is still filtered through politics. Public tolerance still limits endurance. Ambiguity still punishes escalation. The danger is not repeating Vietnam's tactics. The danger is repeating Vietnam's assumptions. Assuming that pressure will clarify. Assuming that effort will accumulate into resolution. Assuming that strength, applied long enough, will force alignment. Vietnam demonstrated that sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes pressure destabilizes purpose. Sometimes effort entrenches contradiction. Sometimes strength, misaligned, accelerates exhaustion. And in those wars, the most dangerous move is not escalation. It is continuing without understanding what kind of war you are actually fighting. Because once that misunderstanding hardens into policy, every correct decision will move you further from victory. And closer to the only outcome the system will eventually allow: withdrawal.